Chapter 8. A Pack Hunts. Johnny had brought a sleeping bag and a camping kit from his cabin in order to spend the night beside the hound, who was too heavy to be carried through the woods properly in his injured condition. Reddy pulled himself under a nearby spruce, whose low-hanging branches protected him from the sun, and there he curled up to rest. He was feverish and would not eat, but water he craved whenever Johnny offered it. He appeared to have accepted the ranger as a nurse, and although watchful, made no effort to stop him when he bathed every wound that he could find with disinfectant, and there were plenty of wounds from the wolves, the wire, and Reddy's own violent thrashing about when in the snare. His whole body was a mass of soreness that could bear only the lightest touch. Johnny had made up his mind to tame the hound, and this was his great chance. He dared not risk leaving him alone through the night, for fear that he would travel away or somehow escape Johnny's influence. At evening the ranger had built a campfire and cooked some simple things for supper, meanwhile watching continually lest Reddy take fright at the sight of the leaping flames and the crackling of the burning twigs. As the shadows deepened, he sat closer to Reddy and talked to him. Disconnected sentences, anything that came to his mind, just to accustom the hound to the sound of his voice. When the black night really descended upon them, he kept the fire going, for he had the eerie feeling that some creature was watching him from the bushes. He thought of Bill and Mose, of grizzlies and lynx. No matter where he sat or what he did, he still had that feeling. And though he had a rifle, he wished that he'd kept the black and tans, instead of leaving them to guard the cabin. At least they could make a noise and give a warning. Before trying to go to sleep, he walked around the campsite, using a weak flashlight to probe the darkness. But he saw only endless numbers of tree trunks and bushes. Returning, he was standing beside Reddy, looking down at him by the light of the fire, when there was a roar directly behind him that could have done justice to a lion. He spun around in time to see a large animal leap back into the shadows. He sensed that it was the king, and for a few moments he was unnerved, for he knew something of the strength and courage of the black wolf. But quickly enough, he realized that had the wolf intended to attack, he would have just done it with silence and his uncanny stealth. No, the king was only trying to frighten him away from Reddy. Nevertheless, Johnny felt anything but secure when he lay on the ground in his sleeping bag and watched the fire grow lower each minute. At any moment that wolf could kill him. But Johnny waited, and nothing happened. Lying there, he heard many things. The owls talking to each other, coyotes yapping somewhere down the valley, stones rolled under the feet of hooved animals, and always the creek gurgled and splashed. And then he heard the wolf whine. It was very close. He did it several times, but there was nothing fierce about that whine. It sounded so plaintive that Johnny felt sorry for the old king. A feeling of security came over him, and soon he slept. At dawn he awoke with a sudden foreboding and looked round to see if Reddy was still there, but the ground under the spruce tree was vacant. Johnny's heart beat fast as he crawled out of the sleeping bag and began to search around the camp. No sign of the hound. However, he soon found tracks in the dust, large ones, such as only the black wolf could make, and he guessed that somehow Reddy, sick as he was, had been lured away. Johnny studied the ground and slowly worked his way up to the bushes. About 100 yards from camp he came upon an uprooted tree, and there he found the hound curled in a bed of leaves, underneath the butt where the roots fanned out and served as a partial windbreak. Reddy looked very sick, but evidently had had all his wounds thoroughly licked and cleansed by the wolf. In fact, beside him was a bare place where the king lay during the night to work over him. Johnny knew that there was no better treatment that could have been found, and his admiration for the big wolf who would face man to aid a comrade gained further ground. The ranger moved his sleeping bag to the hound's new position, and there set up his rough camp. During the day he visited his cabin for more supplies, and to fetch the black and tans, who were glad to leave the lonely ridge, and were happy at the camp as their new home. Johnny had to worry what the black wolf might do to them, but he had great faith by this time in the king's good sense, and took a chance on no mishap coming to the young hounds. He made up his mind long ago that under no ordinary circumstances would he ever try to harm the fine old leader, whose life had been interwoven with his through all the years that he'd been in the service. "You don't kill an animal for whom you have real respect, even if he is a wolf," he told Mac on one of those occasions when they'd been listening to the spirited baying of the king. "Okay," Mac had answered. "I'm with you myself. I like to hear the old boy. But don't ever tell your ideas to anyone else. You're a pretty fair ranger, and you're needed in the job, so don't lose it. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking there are already too many after the old black scalp. It's a miracle they don't get him the way he goes roaming all over the country." "He may have killed a lot of game," mused Johnny, "but he's never done any harm to man, except when he chewed up a few dogs that they sent after him, and that was just self-defense, wasn't it? Just wait till he chews up some of yours." Well, that was something to think about. Already the wolf had deprived him of Reddy. Or had he? That was always the question, as yet unanswered. At any rate, the wolf leader had developed in Reddy the finest hound that Johnny had ever seen. That night the black and tans bayed several times and ran about excitedly, but always returned safely to the fireside. "Good old king," said Johnny with feeling, as he turned over in his sleeping bag to rest even more soundly than before. In the morning the hound was still laying under the fallen tree, and he was looking better. He lapped broth with bread in it, and tried to wag his tail when Johnny talked to him, and the black and tans played around. On the following day he walked stiffly to an open place where he could bask in the sun, and on the third day, when Johnny and the black and tans encouraged him, he slowly followed all the way to the cabin, but he would not go inside. Instead, he found a pile of brush and curled up among the leaves as before. Johnny wished that he could tie him and make sure that he would stay, but he knew that tying him would be the last thing that Reddy would endure. Days passed, and the hounds stayed around the cabin, with the black and tans growing more and more at home. Johnny suspected that the king had given up hope of having him back as a companion, and had gone north on one of his long, hectic rambles that seemed to soothe his nerves. At least the wolf made no further attempt to take Reddy away. By this time Johnny found no difficulty in patting him occasionally, though the hound showed no special interest in any affection demonstration, and was afraid of quick motions and of any attempts to lead him into the cabin or other enclosures, all of which he quite evidently regarded as traps. He slept among the bushes and rocks, no matter what the weather, but strangely enough, he would eat with relish any kind of food that was offered to him. When his wounds were well healed, Johnny took him and the black and tan on hikes around the valley. The hound would walk beside or directly behind the ranger, just as he'd always done with the king, and from Johnny he took directions in regard to what animals he should hunt. As he never hunted unless he was hungry, and now was well fed every day, he showed no particular eagerness to chase the moose, the caribou, and the other game, as long as Johnny did not encourage him. This pleased Johnny more than anything else. When Mac rode up the valley one fine day to pay a visit, and saw the big red hound with the black and tans, his eyes fairly bulged. That Reddy feared him and stayed well in the background made no difference. He saw that a miracle had happened. He looked, and still he marveled. "And what a hound he is," he said to Johnny. "I never saw one so big and fine." Later, he made the ranger tell all that had happened. And when he heard how Bill and Mose had left with threats, he shook his head. For the first time since his arrival, he looked grave. But nothing could long hold down the spirits of these two, and Mac was all for seeing how well the big old hound could hunt. "I'm afraid to start him even after a coyote," sighed Johnny. "He might somehow get the urge to go wild again." "But man, he's no good as a lapdog," urged Mac. "The coyotes around my shack are so bold that they're taking the chickens right from under my nose, so quick that I can't shoot them. There's one big old yellow fellow that I see every day sneaking around, as if he wanted to eat me and own the place. Come down tomorrow and just have one try at him. You'll do more good if you put fear into him than you would around here in a month." Johnny demurred, although his eyes sparkled and he soon began to get almost ecstatic over the idea. Eventually he agreed to try it, and after that the two could talk of nothing else. That night the 4 hounds received an especially good dinner of tinned beef covered with rich soup, and such was the bond between the master and the hounds that they sensed something was afoot and pranced about and played together wildly. Mac slept in the spare bunk at Johnny's cabin, and at dawn their horses were saddled and they were starting single file down the valley with the hounds at heel. "Man alive, I can't wait to see that yellow coyote run," chortled Mac. "Won't he be surprised?" But Johnny was far from being confident that the hounds would do their part. Everything on the journey went smoothly until a young black bear ran across the trail. The black and tan saw him and gave chase with wild baying, Reddy following them without enthusiasm, for he knew there was nothing to be gained by hunting bears. Johnny shouted and tried to head them off, but he found it difficult to force the horse through the timber and only caught up when the bear had made a circle. A good scolding brought them again to heel. When they stuck the trail for the station to Mac's castle, Johnny held the hounds while his friend went ahead to look things over and see whether there was any sign of coyotes. It was not long before Mac's shouts showed that something was afoot, so Johnny hurried to catch up. Mac was dismounted and fairly tearing his hair out with exasperation. He'd come out of the timber very quietly and caught sight of the coyote sitting on its haunches beside the shack, licking its lips after eating his white rooster, which he'd left fastened in the coop. The coyote, evidently knowing that Mac was away, had dug a big hole underneath the side of the coop. White feathers were blowing everywhere. "He wasn't the only one," shouted Mac. "There were 3 others, over beyond where I throw the garbage." "Was the big yellow one there?" asked Johnny. "Of course he was," cried Mac. "He was the lad that killed my poor chicken. He went into the bushes where you see the clothesline." Johnny tied his horse and ran to the spot, the hounds following at his heels. But after the scolding they'd received on account of the bear, the black and tans held back from taking the trail, and Reddy stood solidly watching everything about, without comprehending what all the excitement was about. Johnny saw that he could do nothing with the timid black and tans, so he concentrated on Reddy, calling him and trying to get him interested in the scent. Still, Reddy did not understand, for to him coyotes were like the bear, just a nuisance in the woods, and not the kind of food he wanted. Poor Mac was almost in a frenzy. "Don't you see he needs leading? He wants the wolf to show him the way. If you could imitate the old leader, just howl a few times, it might work. Howl, man! Howl like a wolf following a scent." Johnny instantly saw the possibilities in this ludicrous advice. Crouching where the coyote had left tracks, he made noises which sounded more like an Indian on a scalp hunt than anything else. But Reddy pricked his long ears and came to him to investigate. He sniffed along the trail of the coyote. "Howl, man, howl!" urged Mac, fairly dancing in excitement. But no howling from Johnny was necessary. "Woo, woo, woo!" thundered the red hound, and with a wagging tail he started off on the trail. Behind him at once joined the black and tans, and the whole place fairly echoed with the din. "Boy, oh boy!" yelled Mac joyfully. That was a chase to be remembered. Reddy led all of the time, up the mountain and down the other side, and then on a long, fast run to the north. The coyote turned at last and came back, trying to dodge among the rocks and confuse the big hound. But no coyote could confuse Reddy. Again the din centered around Mac's castle, and then it faded away toward the south. Johnny leapt into the saddle and galloped down the railroad. Mac was too out of breath to do much of anything. Presently the din ended, as if it had been cut off by a knife, and Johnny left his horse and ran on foot into the woods, toward the place where he had last heard the hounds. The question was, had they caught the coyote, or been led over a precipice? Coming breathlessly into a glade, He almost stepped on them, lolling full length around the dead yellowish-gray animal, and panting so hard from the fury of the chase that they could scarcely take any notice of him. Johnny first patted the big hound and then the others, making sure that all knew the pride he felt in them. Coyotes were worse in the game and fur country than rats in a hen house, and unless killed they would rapidly increase. Johnny slung this one, an especially large old fellow, onto his back and trudged to where he'd left the horse. After a little trouble, he got his burden fastened to the pommel of the saddle, and then rode back to Mac almost bursting with pride. Reddy had proved himself a great hunter, and the Black and Tans had ably seconded him. They were turning out to be a good pack. "Of course, Johnny," Mac said gleefully while he stroked the valuable fur of the coyote that he disliked so profoundly when it was alive. "You yourself could be the best hound in the lot with your wow-wow. Only you haven't enough run in ya. Less noise, man, next time, and more speed." And then he added seriously, "Come inside the castle, won't you? It seems to me that this calls for a sort of a celebration." End of chapter 8.